Okay, welcome everyone to the International Interprofessional Mentorship Program. My name is Dr. Kay Barlow. I am the founder and host for today's meeting. It's July 18th, 2022, and today Lyle Duque and Ching are here to talk about disaster management and OT's role. Please mute yourselves during the presentation and we will have a question and answer session at the end. In order to receive a certificate of attendance, please complete the link that I will put in the chat box shortly. At the end of this presentation, we will have an optional meet and greet, and hopefully I'll see you there. So thank you, Lyle and Penny, so much for coming today. We really appreciate your expertise and sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, as the case may be. Penny and I are really happy to have been invited here and to share with you our experiences on disaster risk reduction and response. Just to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about. So we'll do a very brief introduction of ourselves, what we do and how we come about working in this area, and we'll talk about the current and evolving nature and impact of disasters around the world, and with particular examples from the Philippines. And we're going to look at re-examining our roles as occupational therapists in disaster risk reduction and response, and how we can embrace and live the principles of DRRR. And then finally, we will be talking about ways to sustain a disaster risk reduction and response plans and programs. And Penny and I have worked together for a couple of years at the level of the National Association, the Philippine Academy of Occupational Therapists. And I have also worked with her on a personal level with getting off the ground the DRRR policy and plans of my own therapy center in the Philippines. Next slide, please, Penny. So I have a private practice in Tarlac City, which is about 2.5 hours north of Manila. And I sit on the Professional Regulatory Board for Occupational Therapy, which is responsible for the licensing and registration of occupational therapists in the Philippines. And I also sit on the Continuing Professional Development Council for Occupational Therapy and the Committee on Career Progression and Specialization for Occupational Therapists. So Penny and I come some years back, we co-convened the 2 national AOT, Philippine Academy of Occupational Therapists, workshops on DRRR. Okay, and we have had people like Jennifer Creek, Kit Sinclair come over and help us during the first national workshop to draft the National Strategic Plan for DRRR of the PAOT. And we have worked together, as I said a while ago, because I have a private practice in our city. She has worked with us in coming up with a workshop to help us draft our own DRRR program and policies for the center. So that was a very helpful workshop that we had, because we had people from our region coming over, and we held it at my center, and everyone just helped us identify the hazards that we had in our center and what could be possible solutions to those hazards and possible disasters. And I have special interest in sustainability and DRR, but also on financial literacy among occupational therapists. But in general, I actually practice in pediatrics. So I have been working with children most of the time for the past 24 years. Okay, Penny. Penny, would you like to introduce yourself now? Have we lost her?
I think we did. She looked frozen there for a minute. We might have to circle back to her.
Oh, okay. All right. So, well, she's the one she's the one that has the slide. So, would you want us to go ahead, or shall we wait for a
No,
couple of?
Penny's back. She can share
Okay.
her screen again. And Penny, you're on mute. The group is used to this because we always have connectivity issues. So it's no worry. We're very laid back here. Everyone's from a different country. So this is just how it rolls. We do our best.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Penny, all yours.
Apologies for that. I was just cut off when it was my turn. Anyway, I'm Penny. You can call me Penny. I have a long name, but I'm currently the chairperson of the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of the Philippines, Manila. And as Lyle was pointing out, I was the former head of the National Organizations Subcommittee on DRR. So the subcommittee was established in 2013. And so it was established because we really found the need to have a disaster response team composed of OTs, and we invited other professionals from the other professional organizations to come and join us. So when we go to disaster situations, disaster areas, we bring along not only OTs, but we brought along an interdisciplinary team. So my special interest is really in community practice. And so if you take a look at how I introduce myself also, I'm part of the community-based rehabilitation. I was part of a community-based rehab program for several years. I think 6 years. I was the former head of that program at the college, and so everything from community work into this disaster response was all really it all aligned. So that's where my work really is focused on, and currently also because of justice issues and working with persons with disability, my special interest is also in occupational science, of which I am a member of a special interest group with Lyle as well. So we keep on bumping into each other. So the PAOT OSSIG, or the special interest group. So there you have it. Lyle?
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So, we're I'm going to be talking about hazards, disasters, and risks and vulnerability for the first part of our discussion. Okay. So, when we talk about natural hazards, these are naturally occurring physical phenomena. So we have geophysical hazards. Um, for example, you would have earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity. And we are in the Philippines, we are really very familiar with those. Okay. And then we have hydrological hazards that are caused by the occurrence and movement and distribution of water on Earth. So we talk about floods, avalanches. Okay. And then climatological hazards are related to the climate, okay, or changes in climate. For example, droughts and wildfire. And if you've seen that or read the news lately, we have a lot of those um, in Europe right now. I think France and um, Spain are um, experiencing some wildfires and heat waves. Um, Meteorological hazards are those related to weather conditions and the changes in weather conditions, and this would include cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes. In the Philippines, we have at least or an average of 20 typhoons a year. Okay, because given our location on Earth, we are a tropical country, and we are located in what we call the Ring of Fire, which is basically where the tectonic plates meet. So we have a lot of volcanic activity, we have a lot of earthquakes, okay, a lot of flooding, okay, from torrential rains, if not typhoons. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead. So and then we have biological hazards caused by exposures to living organisms or their toxic substances or diseases. And the perfect example, of course, would be the coronavirus, the epidemic. And but you also have like uh, plagues, okay, dengue, Zika, um, Ebola, and all those. Okay, so those are biological hazards. But and then again, we have man-made or human-induced technological hazards that are caused by humans and occur in or close to human settlements. So this would include our emergencies that may be caused by industrial or transport accidents, conflicts, whether armed or not, okay, environmental degradation and pollution. Okay, so you would see that there's actually um, a link between hazards, disasters, and even sustainability or sustainable practice. But uh, I we may not have enough time to fully explore that link. But suffice it to say that there is a clear link between those constructs. Okay, both in theory and in real life. Next slide, please. Um, okay, so disasters are serious disruptions to the functioning of a community when it exceeds its capacity to cope using its own resources. So when an individual or a community is overwhelmed because of um, the hazard, the impact or the consequences of hazards, okay, then you have disasters. And disasters can be caused by either by natural or human-induced and technological hazards. Next slide, please. Hazards may be natural and inevitable. Disasters are not. Okay, so therefore, we will always have hazards wherever we are. Okay, we will always have to deal with the climate. We'll always have to deal with the weather. We'll always have to deal with um, typhoons, storms. Okay, um, but okay, disasters do not necessarily have to happen. Okay, therefore, disasters can and should be prevented. Next, please. So, how do we go about preventing disasters? Okay, so in a nutshell, we have to help individuals and community be prepared, and there is a need to reduce risks and help individuals and communities, societies become more resilient. Okay? So there's a need for us to be able to help individuals and communities first be prepared and to actually avoid disasters happening and to help them manage their occupational lives when they are hit by disasters. Next, please. So um, in this illustration, we look at the relationship between risk, hazard, your exposure to hazard, and your vulnerability. So we're going to look at the first row. So risk is brought about by the control factors related to what kind of hazards do you have in your area, in your community, in your region. Okay, do you have hazards related to the earth, water, to probably vehicular or even industrial accidents? Okay, what is your as an individual and as a community, as a society, what is your level of exposure to these hazards, and how vulnerable are you as a person, or the individuals in your community are? Okay, so it is very important for us to know all of these to be able to come up with ways and to understand how to manage and to reduce the risks that we have, from hazard, and to avoid disasters from happening. So if we are to reduce risk, we need to understand early warning signs and to be able to come up with appropriate emergency responses. Okay, as I've said, there will always be hazards wherever we are, because we are surrounded by earth, water, the elements, all that, um, and our exposure to those hazards can be modified, and we can lessen our exposure to those hazards if we understand and identify those hazards early on. And we decrease vulnerability by increasing our capacity, both on an individual and a community basis, to respond to and recover from disaster. And that's what we were talking about when we talked about resilience. Okay. And in all these, it's very important for us, okay, to especially for us occupational work, because we bring something really very unique to the table when it comes to disaster risk reduction and response. Okay, because we talk about occupation, we talk about occupational lives, we talk about occupational justice. So um, we we look at this from, from a special lens, if you will. Okay, and we need to make sure that any plan of action or framework that we use for DRRR, okay, would be disability inclusive. Okay, it will be inclusive, takes into consideration human rights, okay, and we facilitate occupational justice in the things that we do in this area. Next, please. Okay, so I think it's a very obvious fact that we have been seeing a lot of disasters that are brought about by both natural and human-induced disasters. Okay, and we must um, in our current world, we need to recognize that disasters do not exist in a vacuum. When we look at and work within, you know, uh, a disaster framework or in a situation of disaster, we need to understand that this has come about because of a confluence of factors. It's not just the environment, it's not just the natural hazards. It's also not just because of the people and their actions, but um, it also has to do with institutional things like policies, laws, the implementation or lack thereof of these policies, politics, um, and even social political um, tensions, okay, in certain areas. Next, please. And it's important for us to recognize as well that, at this day and age, disasters are more frequent, okay, and their sequelae are more severe and far-reaching, and they impact individuals' and communities' occupational lives, and they hinder sustainability and social justice. Okay, and in one of the articles that Penny and I wrote for the WFOT bulletin, we looked at how disasters are actually multi-layered, and we provided an example of that. For example, we've had a community that was devastated by flooding from a typhoon, so they were relocated to an evacuation area, and they also came from a um, social economically depressed area. So there were issues related to that. And then 1 or 2 weeks after, there was another typhoon, and there was another community that had to be brought to the same um, areas, okay, to the same evacuation area, and that resulted in some tension between the two communities, and there has been a prolonged stay there because um, while the government was offering to relocate the families to a new and better or safer place, the families just wouldn't, because their livelihood, their all their assets, all the things that they owned were in the old but dangerous communities that they lived in. So um, you see, there are a lot of factors that there are a lot of layers of issues that one would have to deal with in these kinds of situations. Next, please. And also in the Philippines, as Penny mentioned a while ago, we initially had a workshop, a national workshop, and one of the primary objectives of that first national workshop was to come up with a disaster uh, response strategic plan for Filipino occupational therapists. And that from that came the subcommittee on DRRR, as Penny mentioned a while ago. But we did find over the years after that there was something missing in what we're doing. And we realized that it was because we were very focused on the response component in disaster management. Okay. And there was little that was being done in terms of preparedness and risk reduction. Okay. Next, please. And okay, and this was empirically proven, if you will, um, by a research done by Penny and a colleague of hers that found that Filipino occupational therapists were mostly engaged in roles related to disaster recovery and response, and the least in disaster preparedness. Okay, and this kind of focus is actually mirrored by the government's framework as well. In a study by the Commission on Audit of the Philippine government, it found out that most of the resources of the government for disaster management has been on response and recovery and rehabilitation rather than on risk reduction, and preparedness. All right. So, um, there was a realization of that um, imbalance, so to speak, and we started to shift the focus from just recovery and response to getting people and communities prepared and reducing the risks, okay, in communities, and including um, personal risks. Next, please. Okay. So now we are going to look at occupational therapists' role, okay, in DRRR, or disaster preparedness and risk reduction. Okay, so just so we are inclusive in terms of that terminology, so we're going to use DRRR or DPRR. Okay, if you have heard of the latest publication from WFOT, um, they just came out with a freely downloadable manual on disaster risk reduction and response, and Penny is one of the contributors to that manual. Okay, so we're going to be looking at um, our roles at the micro or personal level, at the meso or community level, and at the macro or policy, national and international level. So there, as occupational therapists, um, we have roles that actually cut across, the levels in GRRR. And one of the things that Penny and I would actually like to uh, emphasize, and this is our um, this has become our latest advocate, advocacy, so to speak, when it comes to DRRR, is making sure is encouraging occupational therapists to actually personally embrace disaster preparedness and risk reduction. Okay, so we need to walk the talk, so to speak, and that is at the micro or personal level. Next, please. So we need to look at safety maintenance and emergency management at all levels, at the micro, meso, um, and macro levels. Okay, and um, just an anecdote. Penny and I um, ran this workshop at the Asia Pacific Occupational Therapy Congress, which was held in November last year, on DRRR. And one of the questions that we posed to the participants in that workshop was, how many of you actually have emergency kits or go-to bags? Okay, so how many of you actually, because a lot of the people in that workshop were actually very active in DRRR. Okay, and we knew a lot of them, but surprisingly, we actually had um, less than 20% of those in that workshop who actually had go-to bag. And we even asked people who were managers of occupational therapy departments, or of therapy centers, how many of them actually have integrated DRRR um, principles into their operations manual, or if they even have a policy when it came to uh, disaster risk reduction and preparedness. Okay, and surprisingly, very few of them actually have. So that was really surprising, and that led us to think that maybe we need to look at and really deeply reflect on what we do, okay, in this area of practice, and that I think that one of the first things that we should do is we need to walk the talk, and we need to be models if we are to be advocates for disaster risk reduction and preparedness. Okay, so Penny.
Okay, thanks, Lyle. So I'll continue the discussion from here. Just wanted, since Lyle has been mentioning several times disaster risk reduction, maybe it's good to show you this slide to show you what are the components of that according to the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. So there are six components. It's really composed of a risk analysis. So if you remember and try to recall what the diagram that Lyle, the figure that Lyle showed you about the risk, how do you calculate the risk? It's really several factors. When you multiply, that would increase the risk. So there are several factors, such as hazard. The hazard, you cannot do anything about, but you can reduce the exposure to hazard so that you reduce the risk. And so these, looking at what is your risk, what would be, how would you reduce the cost of disasters, such as, for example, having mitigating plans of actions, things that putting up a wall, or if flooding were one of the hazards that regularly comes in the community, then putting up dikes, or like several of like high up, putting houses on a higher ground would eventually be good mitigating factors. So these are the things that actually we have to work with also other professionals to be able to um, increase our awareness on things regarding how do we actually reduce the causes of disasters or exposure to these hazards. And Lyle also mentioned about vulnerability of people and property. So um, increasing increasing the capacity is inversely related to the vulnerability. So as you increase capacity, the vulnerability um, is reduced. And so you are able to respond better to disaster situations as you improve your understanding of those several things, and as you improve your understanding of the approaches that are necessary for you in order to control your risk of being in a disaster situation. And plus also the wise management of your resources. As OTs, we are so used to evaluating what our clients would have, like all the abilities that they have, and maximizing those abilities. So it's the same thing for communities and reducing risks. What are the resources there are available, and if we can maximize those resources, we have to use them wisely for us to be able to reduce the risks. And then lastly, of course, to improve the preparedness for any of the adverse events. So when we try to work with communities or individuals, we need to find out what are those factors that will affect them in terms of first hazards, and second their capacities, right? So and then we design programs for how do we prepare them just in case there are adverse events. There are two scenarios that we need to be thinking of. One scenario is for them to be sheltering in place. So sometimes I think there are several news also in the States that, when flooding comes in, um, I'm not sure what the recent typhoon was called, but a while back it was Typhoon Katrina, which was really devastating, flooding all over, and there were several people who were in their homes, just sheltered in place, and so there were many that had to be given delivered food to. They had to be given their supplies. So two scenarios for preparedness. First is sheltering in place, and second is what Lau was mentioning about being evacuated in a center, so an evacuation center. So um, I use this matrix when I show that there are levels of preparedness. And if you say preparedness, there are also components of preparedness. So, as there are components of risk reduction, there are also components of preparedness. And preparedness, when you think about preparing somebody, preparing yourself, preparing your family, and eventually the community. You're thinking about contingency planning. What are my options? So if I were to stay in place, or if I were to evacuate, where would I go to? But it's really first identifying what is it that I have exposure to, so that you'll be able to plan better on where on a personal level, where to go, or if it's better to shelter in place. So for instance, for me personally, um, the Philippines is really let's say it's really a hot spot for disasters. So we get typhoons every year, like more than 26 or more than 22 typhoons around. When we name our typhoons, it's usually after the alphabet, and we usually go through all the alphabet letters in a year. And so, yeah, typhoon is one for me, flooding near my vicinity, and there's what they call the big one. So the area in Manila is predicted, or actually it's not predicted, but it's really expected that every 300 years there will be a major earthquake. And so we're anticipating that already. And I've encouraged my students to look at where their houses locations are, and see if they fall within the fault line or along the fault line of this huge the huge fault line where the big earthquake is supposed to happen, or the movement was supposed to happen. It's near, so all the government is preparing for it. Everyone is really being encouraged to prepare for that big one. Despite and in addition to the pandemic. So there, contingency planning is, I have to be thinking of when it happens, where do I go? Which evacuation center should I go to? If there's massive destruction, where's the nearest hospital? If a hospital is also, if what are my options for like nearby hospitals? So those are like the types of information that we need to be thinking of for personally, and for the household, like members of the family, especially children and the elderly members of the family, who might need a little bit more information, or you might need a little bit more direction. So as a household, that should be as planned as well. And institutional, where places of where we work should also have contingency plans, and at the community level. So this is where maybe as OTs we kind of have a bit of a gap, or we don't get involved much at the community level, for us here in the Philippines. So in terms of knowing what is the community plan in terms of contingencies, uh, not all OTs, I would say, aside from Lyle, no, but I'm not sure if there's like um, an improvement now on the awareness of OTs knowing the community's contingency plans. And so that's worth knowing because, as I said, the Philippines is expecting a major earthquake. And so knowing what the bigger picture is is a big help, no, in terms of planning, individual planning. And so another component is also stockpiling. So when you say stockpiling, you identify necessities, identify things that you would need when um, the disaster is going to happen in a week or an extended period of time. So the go bags, as Lyle mentions, as Lyle mentioned, they're very helpful. However, it's not just one go bag that we should be preparing. So we need to actually be thinking of where are the places that I usually go, and if something happens there, do I have something um, that I can easily pull for supplies? No, uh, can I respond? Can I be self-contained, or do I need help? So usually we also should be thinking about these things would also apply to when we're thinking through with families or with our patients. And so with our patients, we need to um, identify with them what are their, especially for pediatric patients, what are their favorite toys, how do they calm themselves, especially with those who have sensory issues. And so their go bags also would have to have supplies that they need, like diapers, things that they would have to have in their go bags, and of course information about their condition. And then the third is the arrangement for coordination and and public information. So all of those should be in the go bag, and of course knowing what else do we need, like training and exercises, how to make our responses more automatic. Um, isn't it that when we learned in OT school that when there's emergency situation, we respond, physiologic response would be either fight or flight, right? Like you cower in fear, or you have that adrenaline rush and to do things, right? And so training in preparedness, that's why we have drills, these drills make our responses more automatic. So it's sometimes, we tend to avoid these drills because we don't really see um, a threat anyway. But yeah, those drills are supposed to condition our physiologic responses to respond in an automatic way, that we don't think about it, but we know then what to do after, if we're given a threat, if we're faced with a threat. And it's not to cower or really break down in fear, but it's really to survive. And so that's one level those are the levels of preparedness that we need to be thinking of across the areas, across all the involvements in our lives, no? In our family level, in our workspaces, and in our communities. So it's a lot to be thinking of. And so the time to act is really now. We don't know when disasters will happen. As Lyle said, it's getting more frequent and it's getting more complex with COVID, and even with the peace and order situation. You don't know that there might be, human induced ones that suddenly, something happens in our workspaces or in workplaces. Um, so we have to be armed with our knowledge and awareness. And as occupational therapists, we have an additional knowledge of occupational analysis or activity analysis. Um, so we look at our perspective is looking at the person in the context and how the person and the environment are, interacting, and we are in a good position to look at, are they prepared to have? Do they have the capacity, the inherent capacity to be able to respond, and is the environment appropriate, or are they able to adapt to the environment, what the environment, the challenges in the environment, that 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 the environment is giving them. So we can actually affect change in occupational behaviors that will enable people to respond to, and then to adapt and survive in emergencies. Um, so yeah, the time to act is now, and to think first to think about the action plans. Um, we have to embrace disaster preparedness and risk reduction as a daily occupation ourselves. So, as I said, it has to start with us. We need to have that increased awareness. Just a case in point, just a very practical way. I always tell this to my students that if you enter a place for the first time, you should be looking at, are there two exit points? In any given, fires are usual hazards that anybody can encounter on any given day. And so when you enter a room, are you immediately able to identify an exit point? Should one exit point be blocked? And so if you cannot, then um, that might be something that, for example, you would want to stay near, have readily access to the single exit point. You might uh, want to also, one action would be to also stay near the alarm or the phone where you can call outside, for outside help should anything happen. So those things as that, to reduce your risk as well should anything bad happen. So those are like just heightening your awareness on a regular day. So is there a way? Of course, the best way is to have two exit points. One that even a window would do, that you can break if the door is blocked with fire or something. So we have to incorporate these principles in practice and even policies when we um, are into when we work in our departments and private practice. And so, yeah, so that's on the personal level. And then on the community level. So this is very much um, new, maybe for a lot of OTs, like working with groups and with bigger groups. So I found this picture which captures all the essential elements needed for community work using community approaches. So it has several things. The very salient one is to know who to contact, or who do we connect with, because it's community level. We cannot exist. Also, we cannot do our approaches just by ourselves. We need to coordinate, and we need to tap into other resources in the community. So some people would already have systems in place. The government should have systems in place that we should know of, and we can actually adopt and modify. Sometimes these plans are not disability inclusive. And so that is where we come in as occupational therapists, because we have that special perspective. We can work with vulnerable groups, non disabled individuals, but with special needs. Maybe the elderly would have, or the older persons would have mobility issues, but they're not necessarily exactly with disability, but just a little because of aging might need some help. But we also have that perspective of how to help them. um, Women, women who are pregnant, they're usually the ones also that are having some difficulties whenever disaster strikes. No, so those are like we can understanding their situation and understanding the challenges, the physical, the demands of the physical environment, and even the psychosocial demands of the situation. That's within our domain as occupational therapists. So that could help make these agencies, government agencies, NGOs, even other groups to understand particular needs or yeah, specific needs of these populations. That's where we can help. And in the engagements that I had, I have learned that there's still space really where OTs can certainly help in disaster efforts. So in this particular photo, this is from an NGO that I have volunteered with in the past. It's a community work that entails working alongside with people with disabilities. It's a group of persons with disabilities that we work with. They're already experts. They know their terrain. They know the annual um, the 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 periodic um, hazards that come their way. So yeah, we need to be able to collaborate. We don't come in as experts, but we have our lenses that we can help and collaborate with them. But we don't pose as somebody that who knows best. So we come in as a collaborator for um, to make them to help them become more aware. So persons with disabilities are not necessarily always included in the plans here in our country, and so that's where I found that I can help contribute. So one community also that we've worked with at the community level is with mothers of children with special needs. So we created a module to help them understand the hazards in their community and the specific action points that they can do. Usually, some of the children, when disaster strikes, some of the children who need um, specialized food, like blender, blenderized or osterized food, uh, would have difficulty obtaining such because of there's no electricity, and so they need to be encouraged to be thinking about what are the tools that I should be bringing along with me whenever disaster strikes so that I can feed my child, for example, so that I can mash the food. What types of food um, should I feed my child? So those are the things that are really very difficult if there's no preparedness. First of all, at the start of everything, and resourcing during a disaster, resourcing for these types of food might really pose a challenge if the community itself is very much stretched already. So but on the other hand, this is also one area where occupational therapists who are into response can help. So looking at special needs during a disaster is where we can also help there. And so maybe just to give background, also I think on a national level, this is really what got us off the ground. Is for is when our national organization established a subcommittee on DRR the RRR. So initially it was just response, and now it's with risk reduction. So together with Lyle is with the Philippine Regulatory Commission, who give out licenses for professionals. So he makes the board exam questions. He's the one. He's our examiner, and so together with that agency, he was instrumental in putting forth, um, including disaster preparedness in the curricula of occupational therapy programs here in the Philippines. So through this subcommittee, um, we were able to be represented. OTs were able to be represented in various agencies. Many of the um, organizations of persons with disabilities are aware that PAOT, or the national organization, has a DRR subcommittee. And so whenever um, there's a disaster, they're able to let us know and tap us for information on how we can help. And we've also encouraged other professional organizations, such as the speech pathologists and the physical therapists, to come and join. And yeah, and on the international level, there's this agency. So I've also volunteered because of the involvement of my school, and also um, the profession. Um, we were able to work with the um, Metropolitan Manila Development Authority. It's an authority under the Office of the President with an especially special role in administrative role in the Metro Manila area. And so they are supposed to have response teams who they deploy um, in case there's disaster in the metro area. And so this particular group that I was involved in was able to help with disability inclusive disaster risk reduction for this national um, agency. And so that's just how I think things are. Sometimes we do it by ourselves, but then when we get involved, even volunteer for um, particular agencies and really have that special perspective that none of them might have thought of, I mean, that would give us an avenue wherein we could promote OT and how we can help. Um, and so, even the Department of Health also understands that we have a role in mental health, in psychosocial debriefing um, on particular cases, especially after disasters. Lastly, how do we sustain these DRR plans and strategies? For these actions to be sustained, it must really reinforce um, in its nature of being iterative. So you learn through the process. It's a reflexive process. So you reflect, you act, and then you reflect again and act. So it's really improving our approaches along the way, and collaborating with people globally. So um, Lal also mentioned that we were able to contribute to the DRR manual of the WFOT. And so this is how we learn together. Um, no single country might really be able to have it all. We learn from each other's experiences, we collaborate, even with those who are not in the health field, with engineers, with those, even the persons with disabilities themselves who have experiences on how they were able to save their family members, on how they want to help and become part of disaster risk reduction. So it's really iterative, and we really build on each other's work. So OTs, we need to recognize that we have to form strategic alliances, and that um, communities of practice um, together with other professions. So this is not just the domain of OTs, but OTs can play a huge part in enhancing um, DRR practices around the globe. So that's it for me, and I hope you were able to learn something. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny and Lyle. I just learned so much. Thank you again. Does anyone from the audience have any questions that they would like to ask? Susan, I see you have a thumbs up. Is that you have a question? Oh, I see Patience has a question. Patience, do you want to go first? Patience is from Uganda.
Okay, hello everyone.
Hello, Patience.
Hello, thank you very much for the session and for taking us through your module. I see you've done a lot and it's wonderful work. So I have a question. You talked about embracing disaster risk. I think something reduction or like in daily occupations or daily life. I would like to just understand more about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what Penny and I have been pushing and advocating with a lot of passion lately is that we need to embrace disaster risk reduction and preparedness as a daily occupation. That what we mean by that is, as occupational therapists, we ourselves should be practicing risk reduction and uh, disaster preparedness ourselves. So that means being aware of the risks we're exposed to, uh, knowing what resources, what actions could mitigate those risks, knowing our vulnerabilities. And of course, this is up on a personal level, okay? And practical things like having our own go-to bags, okay, in all settings where we might get caught in a disaster. Like for me, there are two specific places where I have a go-to bag. I have one at home and I have one in the clinic, okay, because that's basically where I stay most of the time, right? Um, but I also actually have um, a change of clothes and toiletries in my car, okay, because I have had the uh, experience of being caught in a flooded area and I couldn't go home because it was too dangerous to drive. There was a time I was in traffic for 6 hours. So it was very important for me to have food. Okay, I also have food in my bag. It's just actually a pack of crackers, and I always have my water bottle. So and of course, if you can extend that to your family, to your workplace, okay, especially if you're working with fellow occupational therapists mostly, then I think that will be something very good, okay, as a start. That's what we mean by embracing uh, disaster preparedness and risk reduction as a daily occupation. We need to live it. We need to be able to model it. Uh, I was I was uh, I was actually telling and our workshop participants last year that if we are to become advocates for disaster risk reduction and preparedness, then we should be able to demonstrate what being prepared is and reducing risks in our lives really is. Okay, so I hope that was able to clarify for you what we meant by embracing the DRR as a daily occupation.
She wrote in the chat, thank you so much.
All right, welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi, Lyle. This is Susan Skees Herms.
Hello.
And thank you,
Hi,
Penny.
hi, Susan. Yeah.
Hi. I love this. And it's funny because Kit's impact just continues to ripple. But one of the things I really appreciate that message about how critical it is that we're prepared ourselves. And you might remember Mariana D'Amico works with Rick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so we've kind of been starting the last 3 to 4 years, this kind of ripple presentation at state level conferences about be prepared yourself as clinicians. And
Yes.
again, I really thank you all for working on the World Federation's manual, because we're trying to pump that up. But awesome. Love Jarrell's presentation. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And also, I think because when we work with the recovery process as well, it doesn't bode well when people who are supposed to respond are actually survivors of disaster themselves. Okay, and we've had that. We've had several occupational therapists who have trained with in our workshops for disaster response and recovery, and they themselves were caught kind of flat-footed when the disaster struck. And that was all. I have a personal friend who's an OT who was a victim of flooding, and she said it was surreal having to line up to get relief goods and all that stuff, wading through chest deep waters, just to get somewhere to get food. And we said, yeah, I think we need to start with getting ready, because if the responders are not ready or are survivors themselves, then that would have a ripple effect on the recovery and rehabilitation process as well. So we need to, well, I'm not saying that we won't be survivors of those disasters, but we need to be able to get up a lot quicker than everyone else, because we'll be the ones at the front lines, so to speak. Yeah, so it's a very important thing for us to be prepared and to reduce our risks as well. Thank you, Susan.
That was great. Are there any last questions?
Well, Kate, I actually have a question, primarily for our American colleagues, and I am not trying to be controversial or anything, but one of the risk reduction and this sort of fitness things that I think Penny and I are not really very versed with. I mean, gun violence. How does that go? Like, I know that you have lockdown drills and all that, but how exactly do you prepare for that?
So you broke up a little bit on me, Lyle. Can you repeat
Okay.
the question again?
Like with gun violence, in schools and all that stuff. We've never had experience with that, and I was just thinking, how exactly do you prepare for that? I mean, we have earthquake drills, we have fire drills, and I can do it, with my eyes closed now. But with that, how exactly does the framework for risk reduction and disaster preparedness, and that is of course human induced.
Do you mind, Kate? Do you
go ahead.
I'll kind of take this, because it's such a political hot potato, but our children are prepared, and sadly our children are prepared with multiple scenarios, from covering to hiding to evacuating. But that also preps our children for the anxiety and this whole thing that goes along with the mental health of constant, in a community where we are a civil society. Some of our children are exposed to more violence than you might expect in a war zone. So, but generally speaking, the drills are only in school system. You do have drills in hospital settings. And I have to laugh, in the hospital setting, sometimes the drill codes that go as long as 10 or 12 different color-coded drills you have to follow. I think that, the big thing in the US, and like I said, it's a controversial conversation. Many people that are advocating for occupational justice are trying to help move forward with where are the boundaries. There's, where does, and you can tell my political leanings. And that is that I don't believe that tools of war need to have a place in a civil society. But that's, we're very divided right now. But as far as the other thing I was going to make a comment is the US is heavily driven. After 9/11, we have a special division that essentially is over all security and disaster response. And because of that division, sometimes it's hard for healthcare providers to rise to that conversation because it comes out of many of the people in that are either military science or have a background that is less psychosocial oriented.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if that helps you. I know that's one of the reasons why. Yeah, we're trying.
Yes, that was very.
Well, we're trying to launch a community of practice with AOTA that's looking at how can we help individuals with developmental disabilities first because they're most marginalized. And part of that rolls into the mental health piece and the preparation piece, because many times, we're at odds with either, one of the flaws is we have our police who are not trained in military tactics, but then sometimes we'll bring in our National Guard, which are an offset of a military response team. So, like I said, I wish we had a simple answer. I will tell you, Rick wrote about the Pulse nightclub, and my cousin was in the ICU at that hospital when they were bringing all the victims in, and I worked down the street. Mandalay Bay, I lived in Las Vegas when that shooter, I'm sad. I tell my children in their lifetime, I can count at least 10 times that I have had really close proximity to gun violence.
All right, well, thank you, Susan.
Okay, well, if there are any further questions, everyone here can always email me and I will forward the questions. But thank you so much. I will send out the recording and the PDF of your slides within the next couple of days. But thank you so much for this presentation. This was wonderful.